2 years ago, I tested the soil in 3 of my raised beds and found that the compost I had been proudly adding every spring was actually lowering my yields by close to 40%. I'm not exaggerating. My tomatoes were stunted. My lettuce was pale and bitter. The kitchen scrap celery and green onions I was trying to regrow kept failing to establish roots, and the whole time I just kept shoveling on more compost, convinced I was doing them a favor. Here's the thing. Most home gardeners, and I was absolutely one of them for over 15 years, treat compost like it is universally good. If a little helps, more must be better, right? But after I started testing my soil and researching what actually makes compost beneficial versus harmful, I realized something that completely changed my approach. Unfinished or poorly made compost can rob nitrogen straight from your plants, introduce weed seeds and persistent herbicides, throw your soil pH out of balance, and even create toxic, anaerobic conditions around the roots of the very crops you are trying to feed. What I am going to walk you through today is exactly how to make compost that genuinely helps your garden, especially if you are composting kitchen scraps, and just as importantly, how to know for certain when that compost is truly ready to use. I will cover the right ratio of materials, how to manage moisture and airflow, how to monitor the internal temperature of your pile, and exactly how to test for maturity before you ever put compost near your plants. And stay with me to the end, because I will share a simple jar test that takes about 30 seconds to set up and tells you definitively whether your compost is finished or whether it is going to cause problems. That one tip alone would have saved me 2 full growing seasons of frustration. So today, I am going to walk you through the entire process, from kitchen scrap to finished compost, that actually feeds your soil instead of fighting it. Now, before we get into the method, I want to be honest about where I went wrong for a long time, because it is probably the same place many of you are right now. For years, I had a compost bin in the corner of my yard, and my system was basically this. I would toss in banana peels, coffee grounds, eggshells, vegetable trimmings, whatever came out of my kitchen. Maybe once a month I would throw in some leaves or shredded newspaper. I would give it a half-hearted turn with a pitchfork whenever I remembered, and then in spring I would scoop out whatever was on the bottom and spread it across my beds. It looked dark. It smelled earthy enough. I assumed it was good, but looking back, I was making almost every mistake you can make. My pile was too wet, too heavy on kitchen scraps, almost never turned properly, and I was using it months before it was actually finished. If any of that sounds familiar, you are not alone. I was right there with you. Then, about 3 years ago, I started paying closer attention to the science of decomposition, and what I found completely reset my thinking about what compost actually is and what it needs to become something your garden can use. Here's what I learned that changed everything for me. Compost is not just a pile of stuff breaking down. It is a biological process driven entirely by microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, and dozens of other microscopic workers. When you give those organisms the right conditions, they convert raw organic matter into stable humus, which is that dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling material that genuinely improves soil structure, feeds beneficial soil life, and makes nutrients available to your plants over time. But when conditions go wrong, when the pile is too wet, too compacted, or too heavy on one type of material, a completely different set of organisms takes over. These are anaerobic bacteria, and instead of producing humus, they produce compounds like hydrogen sulfide, butyric acid, and ammonia. Those compounds can actually damage plant roots, suppress beneficial microbes in your soil, and create conditions that stunt growth rather than promote it. Research from the University of California Cooperative Extension has shown that immature compost applied to garden beds can temporarily lock up nitrogen in the soil, starving plants of one of their most critical nutrients during the exact window when they need it most. And once you understand that distinction between aerobic decomposition that builds your soil and anaerobic decomposition that harms it, the entire composting process starts to make practical sense. So let me show you exactly how to set this up right from the beginning. The first thing to get right is what goes into your pile, and more importantly, the ratio between two categories of material. In composting, we talk about greens and browns. Greens are your nitrogen-rich materials. These are your kitchen scraps, fruit and vegetable trimmings, coffee grounds, fresh. Grass clippings and the tops from your scrap regrows like carrot tops, celery bases, and lettuce cores that did not take root. Browns are your carbon-rich materials. Think dried leaves, shredded newspaper, or plain cardboard with no glossy coating, straw, dried plant stalks, and wood chips. Now here's where most kitchen scrap composters go wrong, and I certainly did for years. We pile up kitchen scraps week after week and barely add any browns. The result is a slimy, stinky, nitrogen-heavy mess that never really breaks down properly. The ratio you want to aim for is roughly 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen by weight. But, in practical terms, since none of us are weighing our compost ingredients, here's the rule I follow. For every bucket of kitchen scraps you add to your pile, add 2 to 3 buckets of shredded dry leaves or other brown material. I keep a large garbage bag of dried leaves next to my compost bin starting every fall, and I just grab a few, handfuls, every time I dump my kitchen scrap container. That one habit alone transformed my composting. The visual cue you are looking for is this: when you pull back the top layer of your pile, it should look like a moist, mixed combination of recognizable brown pieces and darker, wetter green material. If all you see is a soggy mass of decomposing food scraps with no visible brown material mixed in, you need more carbon. If it looks bone dry and nothing seems to be breaking down at all, you need more greens and some water. Now that you have the right materials going in, let me walk you through the second critical piece, which is moisture and airflow. This is where I see the most problems, even with gardeners who have the ratio mostly right. Your compost pile needs to feel like a wrung-out sponge. That is the classic description, and it is genuinely accurate. When you grab a handful of material from the center of your pile and squeeze it, you should get maybe 1 or 2 drops of water, and the material should hold together briefly before crumbling apart. If water streams out when you squeeze, your pile is too wet and you are heading toward anaerobic conditions. Add more shredded browns and turn the pile to let it breathe. If the material is dusty and falls apart immediately, it is too dry and your microbial activity has likely stalled. Give the pile a good watering with a hose, aiming for that wrung-out sponge feel throughout. For airflow, this is where turning comes in. Those decomposing microbes need oxygen to do their work. When a pile sits compacted with no air movement, the aerobic organisms die off, and the anaerobic ones that produce all those harmful compounds take over. I turn my pile every 5 to 7 days during the active phase. And by turning, I mean I use a garden fork to physically move material from the outside to the center, and from the center to the outside. The whole process takes me about 10 minutes. If you are composting in a tumbler, style bin, give it 8 to 10 full rotations every 5 to 7 days. If you are using an open pile or a 3-bin system, fork it from one bin to the next, or just mix it thoroughly in place. The key is getting that fresh air distributed through the entire mass. One thing I want to mention here for those of you in hotter climates: if you are in United States Department of Agriculture zones 9 through 11, your piles can dry out remarkably fast in summer. I would check moisture every 3 to 4 days instead of weekly, and consider placing your bin in partial shade. For those in USDA zones 3 through 5, your composting season is shorter, but you can extend it by insulating your bin with straw bales in the fall. The biology slows below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but does not stop entirely. Now here's where I want to pause for a moment, because if you are finding this helpful, what I am sharing today is really just one piece of the bigger picture when it comes to growing food from kitchen scraps sustainably. I put everything I have learned into a guide called the 30-Day Kitchen Scrap Garden Protocol. It is a 171-page handbook that covers 31 regrowable crops, a $10 starter kit guide so you do not waste money on supplies you do not need, zero-waste kitchen strategies including composting, and complete troubleshooting support for every stage of the process. You can grab it for $17 at backyardbuddybooks.com or just scan the QR code on your screen right now. It is the resource I wish I had when I started this whole journey. All right, let us keep going. Now that your pile is properly balanced and you are managing moisture and air, let me walk you through what to do with temperature, because this is the part that tells you whether your compost is actually working. A healthy, active compost pile generates its own heat as those aerobic microbes break down organic matter. In the first week or two after building or turning a well-balanced pile, the internal temperature should climb to between 130 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the thermophilic phase, and it is where the fastest decomposition happens. It is also where weed seeds and many plant pathogens get killed off, which is one of the biggest reasons temperature matters. I use a simple compost thermometer with a 20-inch probe. You can find these for about $12 to $15 at most garden centers or online. Push it into the center of your pile, wait about 2 minutes, and read the temperature. If your pile is not heating up above 90 degrees Fahrenheit after a week, one of three things is usually the issue. Either you do not have enough green material and need to add nitrogen sources, or the pile is too dry and needs water, or the pile is too small. You generally need a pile that is at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet to generate and retain enough heat for thermophilic composting. When the internal temperature drops back down below 100 degrees after a peak, that is your cue to turn the pile. Turning redistributes the material, introduces fresh oxygen, and usually triggers another heating cycle. Over the course of about 6 to 8 weeks with regular turning, you will notice that the pile stops reheating after you turn it. That means the most readily available organic matter has been consumed and you are entering the curing phase. Do not skip this part. The curing phase is when your compost transitions from active decomposition to stable humus, and it typically takes an additional 3 to 4 weeks. I let my piles cure untouched for a full month before I even think about using them. Here is where everything comes together, and honestly, this is the part I wish someone had drilled into me years ago. You need to test your compost for maturity before you use it. Finished compost should look uniformly dark brown to nearly black. You should not be able to identify any of the original materials. No recognizable food scraps, no intact leaves, nothing that looks like what went in. It should smell earthy and pleasant, like forest floor after a rain. If it smells sour, like vinegar, or sharp, like ammonia, it is not done. The texture should be crumbly and loose, not slimy or compacted. And when you pick up a handful, it should feel light and airy, not heavy and waterlogged. If your compost fails any of these checks, give it another 2 to 4 weeks of curing with occasional turning. Using it too early is exactly how I ended up with that 40% yield drop I mentioned at the start. Immature compost continues decomposing in your garden bed, and those decomposing microbes consume soil nitrogen to fuel their work, leaving your plants starved at the worst possible time. And once you know your compost is truly finished, here is how to apply it correctly. This is another place where more is not better. And I learned this the hard way. For established garden beds, I apply a layer about 1 to 2 inches deep over the surface of the soil in early spring, roughly 3 to 4 weeks before my last frost date. I do not till it in deeply. I let the earthworms and soil biology do that work over time. For container gardens and raised beds where you are regrowing kitchen scraps, mix finished compost into your potting mix at a ratio of about 1 part compost to 3 or 4 parts potting mix. That gives you the biological benefits without overwhelming your growing medium. If you are in USDA zones 7 through 9, you can also do a lightfall application, about 1/2 inch, which will continue to feed the soil over winter. In colder zones 3 through 6, I would wait until spring when the soil biology is waking up and can actually make use of those nutrients. One thing I want to be clear about is that compost is a soil amendment, not a fertilizer. It improves soil structure, water, retention, and microbial health over time. But it does not replace the need for balanced nutrition, especially for heavy-feeding crops. I think of compost as feeding the soil, which in turn feeds the plants. It is a longer game, and the results compound over seasons rather than showing up overnight. Now let me walk you through a few patterns I see over and over again that cause the most trouble, because being aware of these can save you a lot of wasted time and damage plants. The first pattern is using compost before it is finished. I already touched on this, but I want to emphasize just how common it is. I did it myself for over a decade. The compost looks dark, it smells okay, so we figure it must be ready. But if you can still identify chunks of original material in there, or if it heats up again when you pile it together, it is still actively decomposing. Applying it to your beds at that stage creates the nitrogen lockup I described earlier. The better approach is to always run a maturity test before application. Use the visual and smell checks I described, and use the jar test I will share with you in just a minute. The second pattern is adding the wrong kitchen scraps. Most of us know not to add meat or dairy to a home compost pile. But there are subtler problems. Citrus peels in large quantities can drop the pH of your pile significantly and slow down microbial activity. Onion and garlic scraps in excess can have a similar antimicrobial effect. What I have found works better is adding citrus and allium scraps in small amounts mixed thoroughly with other materials, rather than dumping an entire bag of lemon peels on top at once. Keep these to no more than about 5 to 10% of your total green material by volume. The third pattern is never turning the pile. I understand the appeal of passive composting. You build it and walk away, and it will eventually break down even without turning. But it can take a year or more, and in the meantime, anaerobic pockets develop throughout the pile, producing exactly the harmful compounds we have been talking about. If you are going to use passive composting, at minimum, I would extend your curing time to 6 months before use and give it a very thorough mixing before application. But I strongly recommend active turning every 5 to 7 days if you want compost that is reliably safe and beneficial for your garden within 2 to 3 months. The fourth pattern, and this one surprised me when I first learned about it, is composting grass clippings or garden waste from lawns or beds that have been treated with persistent herbicides. Certain herbicides, particularly those containing aminopyrrolid or clopyrrolid, can survive the entire composting process. They do not break down in the pile. And when you apply that compost to your vegetable garden, they can damage or kill broadleaf plants like tomatoes, beans, peppers, and lettuce. If you are not 100% certain that your lawn, clippings or hay or straw are herbicide-free, leave them out of your vegetable garden compost. It is not worth the risk. Now here's the bonus I promised you at the beginning, the jar test. This is the simplest and most reliable way I have found to determine whether your compost is truly mature and safe to use. Take a clean mason jar or any glass jar with a tight-fitting lid. Fill it about halfway with a sample of your compost from the center of the pile, not the surface. Seal the lid tightly and set it in a warm spot, like a sunny windowsill or on top of your refrigerator, for 48 hours. After 2 days, open the jar and immediately smell the contents. If it smells the same as it did when you sealed it, earthy and pleasant, your compost is finished and stable. The microbial activity has settled down and the organic matter is no longer actively decomposing. But if you open that jar and get hit with a sour, rotten, or ammonia-like smell, your compost is still actively decomposing. Those anaerobic conditions build up inside the sealed jar because there was still enough unfinished organic matter to fuel microbial activity that consumed all the oxygen in that enclosed space. That compost needs more time. Give it another 3 to 4 weeks of curing with regular turning and test again. I run this test on every single batch now before it goes anywhere near my garden beds. It takes 30 seconds to set up, costs nothing, and it has completely eliminated the problem of immature compost damaging my plants. So if you found today's walkthrough helpful and you want to take your kitchen scrap growing to the next level, I really do recommend checking out the 30-day Kitchen Scrap Garden Protocol. It is 171 pages covering 31 different crops you can regrow from scraps, a complete $10 starter kit guide, zero-waste kitchen strategies that tie directly into the kind of composting we talked about today, and full troubleshooting support for every stage from scrap to harvest. You can find it at backyardbuddybooks.com or scan the QR code on your screen. It is $17, and honestly, it is the kind of practical step-by-step guide I wish it existed when I was making all those mistakes I told you about today. You know, when I think back to that soil test 3 years ago, the one that showed me my compost was hurting my garden, I remember feeling frustrated, but I am actually grateful for it now because it forced me to learn what good compost really looks like and how to make it consistently. Your kitchen scraps are a genuinely valuable resource. They just need the right process to become the soil builder your garden deserves. If you try any of this, especially that jar test, let me know how it goes in the comments. I would love to hear about it. Until next time, happy growing.